Welcome to this webinar on digitalisation in transport and freight. I'm Ian Christensen, the Managing Director of iMOVE and your host for this webinar. Today we're going to hear from two experts in the transport space from Swinburne University. They're going to share with us the outcomes from a study they recently completed. That study examined how transport in Australia compares with the rest of the world in its engagement with digitalisation. Before I hand over to Professor Hussein and Dr. Hadi Ghaderi, I want to share with you my enthusiasm for this study and this report. Digitalisation of transport was one of the key reasons for the formation of iMOVE. Pardon me. So it's very helpful that at this point, halfway through the life of the CRC, we can get an overview of how Australia is progressing and get some visibility of the opportunities that are in front of us. As you listen to today's presentation, I would challenge you to consider which of the emerging opportunities are relevant to your organisation and how can iMOVE help you realise those opportunities in the next couple of years. I encourage you to submit questions to our speakers through the Q&A function, which can be accessed through the button at the bottom of the screen. I'd also like to acknowledge the support that iMOVE receives from the Federal Department of Industry and the support that iMOVE received from the Federal Department of Infrastructure to undertake this project. We also appreciate that the government is currently in caretaker mode, which imposes stringent constraints on what the departments can say and do. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First, Professor Hussein. Professor Dia is the Chair of Civil Engineering at Swinburne and has been involved in transportation for many years. Presenting with him is Dr. Hadi Ghaderi. Dr. Ghaderi is an expert in supply chain transformation and has a keen interest in the opportunities for improvement that digitalisation presents. Professor Dia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start it here. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today and present the findings of this study that we completed late last year. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located. And on behalf of those present, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. This project has been quite a collaboration between three organizations, the iMOVE, the Department of Infrastructure, and Swinburne. So I would like to extend my sincere acknowledgement and thanks to all those who were involved and who guided us throughout the project. Also, to acknowledge the Swinburne researchers in particular. So this afternoon, we'll take you through the research aims, the framework we use for understanding the digitalization, go through the benchmarking of best practice. Hadi will take us through the stakeholder consultations, and I will conclude with some policy lessons and recommendations for future research directions. So this particular study was to review international best practice in transport and freight digitalization to understand particularly how they can support performance of transport in areas that include safety, productivity, sustainability, and resilience. And then to identify best practice case studies, what are their benefits, what were the success factors behind them, do the benchmarking. We agreed with the team to do the benchmarking across OECD countries in particular, identify the learnings and do the stakeholder consultations and come up with some policy levers that governments can use. So essentially, this is the framework we adopted. And what it says is that usually you start with policies and objectives that are set by communities, by governments. That might include, traveler well-being, economic viability, sustainability. Underneath these, you would have a number of sectors and industries that would support the delivery of these policies and objectives. And when it comes to digitalization and smart mobility, for example, these would be underpinned by a smart mobility platform that is enabled by a large number of technologies. I think the key takeaway here is that technologies on their own, as we know, are not the solution. They need to address a key use area. So we divided the transport area into 7 sectors that include road, public transport, freight, etc. And within each sector, we identified what we called functional areas that can be digitized or digitalized to provide productivity services. So in total, we had 7 sectors and also 40 functional areas. So the first part of the project was to undertake a comprehensive literature review where we used both academic and industry and public sources to undertake a bibliometric analysis of the literature. Examples of some of the sources are listed here. And then we looked at, particularly from that outcome of the review, to look at the best practice case studies from around the world. So we came up with 40 of these tables. So each table represents a functional area within a sector. As an example, this is the adaptive traffic signal control functional area within the road sector. So for each of them, a description, examples, what are the enabling technologies, what are the benefits, how mature are the technologies, what sort of benefit cost ratios have been reported in the literature, what are the success factors or barriers. And for each of these, we provided also some commentary around how Australia is doing for each of these functional areas. So in the report, you would find 40 of these tables. And then we summarized, based on that, what are the benefit cost ratios for key transport and freight digitalization solutions. So as you can see, we identified both an upper range and a lower range because the benefits will depend to a large extent on the baseline conditions of a country or a city in which these technologies are being implemented. But just to give you an idea, usually when we build a new infrastructure like a road or tunnel, I think it's safe to say we would be lucky if we get a benefit cost ratio of 3. As you can see here, the BCRs for digitalization are quite significant and much larger. We also looked at some of the emerging technologies and their applications, and we identified their maturity level and also what their impacts are likely to be going forward. So this includes, for example, Internet of Things, AI, connected and automated vehicles, urban air mobility, and so forth. And for each of these, we also identified which policy objectives they address and what impact they will have. We then proceeded to develop a best practice transport digitalization index based on the OECD countries. Essentially, it was a composite index for each functional area and sector based on 10 international indicators in 3 pillars, in addition to the indices we developed in this study. So the first pillar is productivity, for example. And as you can see, these are the indices used generally. There is another one on acceptance pillar and also the policy and regulations. Here's an example of one of those pillars, and the report, which is now available on the iMOVE website, details these. What are their limitations? What do they represent, etc. And we came up with this table to summarize for each OECD country what are the indices in each index that we have selected. So Australia, for example, came out at around 15 in this ranking. I just want to draw your attention to a number of values here. The connectivity index, which scored very low for Australia, because I want to talk about that in a later slide. So essentially, this gave us an idea about simply if we look at these global indices without taking the indices from our study, this is how the landscape looks like. And then we added to this the sector and functional area indices, which we developed in this study. Now, these indices we came up with, were based on the review of the technical literature, the case studies, looking at international indices that are specific to each functional area. And then we coded them in this traffic signal or traffic light form, if you like, to show what is best practice and what is low practice. So, for example, if we look at areas, and for each country, we came up with a score based on these criteria I highlighted before, and basically identified who are, what is the country's digitalization index and the rank. Rest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to present a few of them. And then we looked at a representation using this radar diagram. You can think of this as if the circle is quite smooth, then international best practice is similar. But if you see a lot of spikes, it means that different countries have different adoption rates. And also the impact of the digitalization is going to be different as well. This is for public transport. And again, we compared everything, you will see it in the report, with road, because the road sector was identified as actually having the most digitalization up to date. And there is a history for that, especially in Australia. Since the 70s, a lot of the technologies have been developed. And again, a representation on the diagram. And on the left here, sub-indices, we realized, where are the key areas that would need improvement. And then we put all these together, essentially, and came up with an overall index, if you like, for each of the countries. So you can see Australia is ranking at number 13 here, while South Korea came as number 1. And this is, again, a representation of the ranking. Again, comparing the overall index to the road index, which, as I mentioned before, seemed to have the largest impact. We then looked at regional groupings. So we looked at, within the OECD countries, we looked at Asia Pacific, including Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, Europe and West Asia, Americas, and Latin America. And we came up with a similar diagram, but this one is based on the regional groupings, just to show as well where Australia sits in regards to its counterparts in the region. Now, of course, with these indices, there are many limitations, and I've listed some of them here. The report goes into much more detail. In particular, what we identified here is a pillar that we would have liked to use, but there was a data gap we couldn't get, which we are recommending is that future research would look at. In particular, it's the investment pillar. So what is the transport technology investment in each of these countries as share of GDP? We found indices from the OECD which looked at investment pillar of transport infrastructure bill, but that was decided not to be accurate because of the different cost of construction. So even though Australia might spend more on infrastructure, it doesn't actually translate in more kilometers of roads or public transport lines, etc., compared to other countries. Going back to that particular index where Australia scored really low, I think the ranking was, or the score was 27. We are aware that in Australia, there is an Australian-based index for network connectivity. We looked at it. However, unfortunately, we couldn't use it because, as you can see, it did not cover all of the OECD countries. But, looking at this, you can see that if you use this measure, that particular index would have increased for Australia. Having said that, it is the same index that has been used throughout all the comparisons. So it is the same methodology, if you like. I'll stop here and pass it to Hadi to take us through the stakeholder survey.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Jan. Complement our literature review and the technical analysis, we also did a comprehensive stakeholder consultation. The stakeholder consultation, we work closely with the department to identify and communicate with a group of selected participants representing government, industry, research organization, and peak bodies. Next slide, please. At a glance, we had 27 participants with 100% survey completion rate, with 80% of them had some levels of involvement in the freight transport. We had a very good mix of participants across both public and private domains, and mostly they hold senior roles. Next, please. In the first question, we were interested to capture the top 3 challenges facing the Australian transport and freight industry in adoption of digitalization. The first area was related to data. While data was considered as an enabler, there were challenges in relation to standards, data sharing and exchange frameworks, and privacy and trust. The second one was around technology, particularly around disparity of technology, its maturity across various functional areas, and existing knowledge and capability. The third area was around government, particularly around coordination, collaboration, but also consistency in legislation. Next slide. Next, we were keen to look at what opportunities exist as a result of digitalization. The first was around supply chain and operational efficiencies. Participants, revealed digital technologies could facilitate the access to real-time and reliable data, which is essential to improve operational efficiency, asset utilization, and automation. Next was around optimized infrastructure investment, especially around better in planning, investment in the infrastructure sector, support transport and freight. And finally, sustainability was another key areas, particularly around social sustainability and enhanced social outcomes. Next, please. We also tried to capture what are the concerns resulting from digitalization. The first was around data and cyber physical resilience. Cybersecurity was considered the top concern when digitally integrating complex and multi-layered transport networks. The next was around having a vision for adoption, and participants revealing that without appropriate vision and regulatory frameworks, the industry could end up with significant duplication of digital systems. Next was around having appropriate risk and reward mechanisms in terms of investment and return on investment. And finally, social outcomes was participants observed digitalization as an enabler to minimize gap in social inequity, but also there were discussions around how digitalization could impact workforce. Next, please. The good news is majority of participants, 77%, demonstrated a very positive, strong sentiment towards the future impacts of digitalization on their organization, but also within their industry. So this is quite impressive and hopeful. But there are few responses and feedback around that. They were unsure, and it was mainly around outdated regulatory and operational frameworks that could potentially impede the uptake of new technology in their industry. Next, please. We also try to capture how to prepare for digitalization. A number of themes were identified. First one was around government and regulation. So it was evident that there's a need around a leading responsibility of government in establishing a vision and addressing the barriers and challenges to digitalization. Next was around developing research and capability, especially around workforce and knowledge management. Next was around enhanced collaboration and coordination between different levels of government, but also between government and industry. Data standardization was also viewed quite high, and particularly around establishing an industry-wide accepted data collection, exchange, and integrity framework. Next was around having a single nationally agreed roadmap and a strategic plan to understand the future state of industry in the presence of digital disruptions and the digital technology adoption. And finally was around establishing a culture for change, having an acceptance culture before implementation of digital technologies. Next slide. Also, we we had a chance to capture some open recommendations, which were around new digital models, federal government leadership, cyber physical resilience and integrity, collaboration between different levels of government, and also with other industries, not only freight and transport, data standardization, and there was a lot of focus around education and upskilling. Next. And finally, as a summary of our stakeholder consultation, we had some key takeaways. The first was seen as data as a double-edged sword. So while access to reliable and quality data was identified as a catalyst for digital growth and innovation in transport and freight sector, it was also evident that the majority of participants have meaningful concerns about having lack of nationally accepted system for collection and exchange of data, particularly around freight and supply chains. But also, it was highlighted that future efforts around capture and exchange of transport and freight data must be federally driven, but in consultation with states and local jurisdictions, because mainly state-based systems are complex and expensive to expand nationally. And finally, it appears that respondents have already identified several opportunities to improve productivity through adoption of digitalization, including access to real-time and reliable data, which is essential for improved operational efficiency, asset utilization, and automation. So this is perhaps a positive sign, revealing that the industry is already trialing the uptake of new technology. Thank you. This was a summary of the stakeholder consultation.
Thank you, Hadi. So the next stage of the project looked at identifying some policy lessons from those nations that came on top. So in terms of their transport digitalization. So some of the common themes we found is that these countries, these nations had a national vision, as you would expect, a commitment to funding, regardless of whose governments, etc. A lot of emphasis on partnerships and collaborations, getting the private sector involved, looking at the, how do you address cybersecurity, standardization, and so forth, R&D and education at all levels, promotion of innovation and competition, etc. And I think importantly, looking at funding projects based on performance, regardless of where they are in the country or a particular nation. Some of the recommendations that we came up with, clearly the first one is to develop a national vision for smart mobility across Australia. We have, for example, a number of strategies currently going. It would be good to include transport particularly in them. We gave the example of Singapore, which, by the way, it is a non-OECD country. If it had been included, it would have probably been in the top 5. They have a Smart Nation program, or if you like, that has embedded in it transport in particular, looking at even examples of deployments over the next 5, 10, 20 years. The second one is to look at harmonizing the existing policies. As you can see here, there are a number of organizations working on this. So it would be good to get alignment of the digital transport initiatives and include these within the national vision. Australia supporting translational research. Australia does well usually in terms of its research excellence, but scores poorly in terms of collaboration with industry, as you can see in these two diagrams. So looking at how do you support translational research so that it doesn't become just a study on a shelf somewhere, rather it needs to be commercialized and deployed. Investment in backbone digitalization infrastructure. So, we gave examples here of South Korea, Japan, where they have actually invested relentlessly, if you like, over the years, so that they reached a stage where digitalization is just everywhere, which at the same time supported not only transport, but other sectors and industries. clearly, in order to get to that digitalization stage, if you like, you need to have a skilled workforce. So investment in human, organizational, and institutional learning. And it doesn't need to be, we're not talking about only higher degrees, higher education degrees. It could be even professional development courses, etc. I'm glad to say that with the department and iMOVE, we're currently also conducting a research project on future skills of digitization for Australia as well. And finally, this recommendation was to develop agreed open data standards, as was mentioned by Hadi through the stakeholder consultations, to look at interoperability, to improve data sharing. I think there needs to be some sort of custodians of this data. We gave an example of this particular collaboration or initiative in Brazil, where they have an integrated, if you like, smart infrastructure operations center, and that similar things could be replicated across different states. And finally, we identified some future direction. I think the key one, as I mentioned before, is really to start to gather data on transport technology investment as share of GDP. This will be an important input into such rankings in the future. At the moment, you can get information about what is the total cost of infrastructure, but usually technology is an add-on, so it is not very clear exactly. And decarbonization is becoming very important. So to develop a transdisciplinary smart mobility research agenda, by this we mean not only universities, but also university in conjunction with the industry, similar to what we are doing here with iMOVE and their partners. And to be able to link these to a number of standards, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We provided some ideas of what this research agenda can look like, but clearly there would need to be, perhaps a national summit where we can discuss these initiatives and come up with a research agenda to take us into the digitalization age. That concludes my presentation. I'll stop sharing and pass it back to Ian.
Thank you, Professor Deer. So that was a very comprehensive survey of all aspects of transportation and freight, and looking at the impact that digitalisation is happening and Australia's level of engagement. So there are already several questions coming through on the Q&A, and we'll come to them. Can I encourage friends in the audience to put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and submit your question as well. And while you're doing that, so one question that has been submitted is a kind of a good one, an obvious one, and one that we would really like to take up with. What are the quick wins that are immediately available to us? Where do you think we should spend our next dollar in terms of improving the Australia's performance in digitisation of transport? I don't know, Hussein or Hadi. Perhaps Hussein, would you like to start, and then Hadi might reflect in the freight area where the most immediate benefits might be obtained.
All right. So one thing we struggled with throughout this project is, quality data. If you want really to do benchmarking, you need that quality data. So this would be probably a good place to start, is, as I said, perhaps to identify custodians to actually not only collect the data, but also to be able to analyze it, massage it, make it available in a form that is available to others to use. To get to that stage, you need to start with to instrument the infrastructure. You need to start by collecting information, collecting the data, and understanding how it is operating now, so that you can propose methodologies or optimization techniques to improve. So that would be a good place to start. Australia has already done very good in a number of digitization and digitalization aspects, particularly in roads, and in particular with the adaptive traffic signal control systems and also managed motorways. These are already two big wins for Australia, where I think more investment in these, because I know there's an export market for that as well. So this can only not help Australian productivity, but can also open up opportunities for us overseas.
Thanks, Hussein. Hadi, would you care to add to that?
I think looking at this from a more freight and supply chain perspective, it is far more complex sometimes than personal mobility, because we're talking about cross-jurisdictional transport and movement of the goods and involving multiple jurisdictions and organizations and players. So the benefit is probably even more evident in the freight sector. In terms of quick wins, it's very hard to come with, but potentially I can also answer question, because my answer would also relate to question one, which is around data. And yes, I think there are quick wins. iMOVE has been doing work within the National Freight Data Hub, and the establishment of the National Freight Data Hub prototype website is a fantastic initiative, a very good start, and to see how we can start collecting data. Yes, I think also in terms of quick wins, would be interesting to invest in some control or managed trials or pilots, which can better show the benefits of such data sharing to the actors involved as well.
Thanks, Hadi. And to the audience for this webinar, if you have ideas for quick wins that could improve our overall score in terms of digitization of transport, I'm very happy for you to use the Q&A button or the Q&A forum to make your suggestions, because I think we are all keen to make progress here in the best way possible. So on the question of standards, I think there is an initiative underway in the freight area by the National Freight and Data Hub people and the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport and Regional Economics to actually start to develop a common view on data standards, especially as it relates to freight. Is there need for standards in other areas of transport as well?
Yes, I think probably the answer to that is solid yes. I think one of the issues in recent times that has come up, and we might need to have standards that apply to other industries as well, is the privacy, cybersecurity, and so forth. But even if you look at public transport, if you look at the road sector, there, as I have shown in one of the slides, especially with some of the emerging technologies, I think there needs to be a lot of standardization. We are pushing ahead with an agenda for connected and automated vehicles, for example. But what is the national landscape around this? I know states have, if you like, mandate over what happens on the roads, but I think there needs to be standards around this at a national level as well.
I think I would endorse that, Hussein. I think we are all keen to avoid having a repetition of multiple rail gauges in the sort of vehicle transport or road transport space.
Yeah. And we always give the example of the tolling industry, where now, with one tag, with one smart tag on your windscreen, you can travel anywhere in Australia. And have it, rather than having 5 or 6 of these tags in a vehicle. So that is just an example of something that can be easily done, as the industry has demonstrated.
And it's also a good example, Hussein, of the industry players and the jurisdictions, the states and the federal government, in a way, getting together and recognizing and agreeing that a consensus approach is ultimately the most productive outcome for the nation. So, and so there's a question here about did your research compare different states in Australia? I don't know. Do you have a reflection on the differences between states, or?
Yeah, we have some reflections, but the data we have is not granular enough to allow us to do that. We have some ideas, etc., but we kept this at a national level, particularly when some of these international digitization indices that we use, they would be very difficult to translate down to a state level.
Yeah, so that question of national indices is quite important, because there's another question here, kind of asking what do we have to do for Australia to become #1, and recognizing that means that puts us in direct competition with Korea, Japan, Singapore, who, as you pointed out in your presentation, have made substantial and sustained investments in digitization, in fact, not just in transport, but across their whole economy. I wonder if you would be willing to reflect on Australia's approach to the national engagement with digitization and its likely effect on the digitization of the transport sector.
Yeah, I mean, if I reflect on the two examples I gave before with like SCATs, for example, and adaptive traffic control systems, Australia has been leading this since the 70s. And if you look at one of the things we did when we were looking at the indices for countries is we also looked at how scaled up these deployments are, because you could have, for example, a country that is implementing a state-of-the-art managed motorway or adaptive traffic control system, but they're only implementing it on 2% of their road network. The productivity benefits would be far different from another country, which probably has a less developed system, but they're implemented on 99%. Like in Korea, I think what they did is they had a target, is that by a certain date, I would need to have sensors on all roadways and on all motorways. So that gives you an idea about perhaps as you said, the level of sustained investment that is, and dedication, if you like, that is required to deliver benefits and outputs.
Thanks, Hussein. Hussein, can I get you to think about the question that's been raised around the measures we use for heavy vehicle safety, and while you're thinking about that, I want to pick up on Andrew Ethel's comment about the level of change that's occurring in the freight industry, most especially in the private sector. Well, the freight industry is in the private sector, so that's fair. And Andrew, yes, I would endorse your comment. I think behind the scenes, the embrace of digitization, the recognition that digitization is important, has increased enormously. I'm wondering. And maybe I can't actually ask Andrew through this forum, but maybe Hadi, could you comment on how you see the evolution of digitization within individual corporations and then across all corporations together in the freight sector?
Okay, sure. And if it's fine, I'll also like to, because there's a question of change. There's a question on the top as well around how you identify the changes associated with the digitalization of transport, and how this is reflected in an organization. So I mix these two together if it's fine, because they both related to change. I was talking to one of our industry partners, a major 3PL industry, last week. They said we're looking at a role called change manager. And that reflects, because especially in the 3PL, in the warehousing and logistics, change is so inevitable, it's so fast, it's so dynamic, it's part of their role, and it's part of their daily role. So therefore, it has become quite evident that there is a need for such responsibility within the organization. I do agree with Andrew's point on that within the logistics sector, digitalization, the uptake of digitalization is quite fast. But I have some levels of concern if the digitalization is performed individually in isolation. There would be very little synergy for optimized supply chain. Yes, the company, the 3PL, would be able to improve its firm performance, its individual, KPIs. But then, what's the impact on the infrastructure if we do not benefit from this digitalization across an industry, across the supply chain? But yes, absolutely, they are doing fantastic job. A lot of 3PLs, particularly we look at Australia, a lot of in the e-commerce industry, the level of technology adoption within warehousing, within picking and ordering, automation, AMRs, it's quite significant. But to achieve, because these when we look at, for example, trucking industry, it's part of it's the core of logistics. They are using the shared infrastructure with public transport as well. So therefore, I do not see them separate from each other, to be honest. And to achieve, an optimized situation, there is a need for further collaboration and synchronization of these data with other data sources.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
Thanks, Hadi. So, Hussein, are you in a position to respond to the question about the analysis of heavy vehicle safety and the time frame over which improvements to heavy vehicle safety necessarily take place?
Thank you. Yes, I'm looking at the question. I probably we need to take this offline because I don't understand. I don't recall the use of 1 year of data in particular. The one thing I can do is we looked at it is over years. But the one thing I would also add is that if you were to repeat this analysis every year, probably you would end up with a little bit of variations. I think what we have done in this particular project is to develop a framework where others, the data is available online, etc., where others can use the same framework to test, future movements in these indices. But I would be more than happy to look, because I don't understand the question. I can't recall that we used one particular year, but happy to take it offline.
Okay, so to the person who kindly submitted that question, if you would care to email the question to us or to Professor Dia, we will undertake to answer it, and we'll get the answer back to you if we can identify a contact for you. So I would now like to go to Giorgio Kanan's question, which goes to the challenge we have in Australia of, I think it's over 800,000 kilometres of roads, many of them unsealed. And so how do we measure our performance at digitalising our road network when we've got so many kilometres of, shall we say, remote and regional roads compared to Japan or Korea, who have vastly less roads and none of it, more than 100 kilometres from a community or intense development. Hussein, is there a way in which the comparisons that you made accommodate the different geography and scale of road network?
Yes, and I think these will be reflected in the indices we developed, because we looked at the scale of deployment of each, of technologies in each functional area, etc. As an example, I totally agree with this, and they will impact the benefit cost ratios. An example that comes to mind is, road closures, particularly in far north Queensland, as a result of floods, etc. You have these long stretches of road. The difficulty is that if one of the roads is flooded and closed, it's very difficult to convey information to people in time, etc. So I think the BCR, or the benefit cost analysis, would need to look at what are the benefits according to government, according to community, what is it we want to achieve for rural roads, and based on that to invest accordingly. I mentioned sensors, but nowadays, it could be satellites, it could be other technologies that probably are not as expensive to deploy. One of the difficulties with like sensors in the pavement is that, yes, you need to go and put them and maintain them, make sure they're operational, etc. But nowadays, with drones, with other technologies like satellites, it is actually possible to come up with more cost-effective solutions for rural areas.
Thanks, Hussein. Now, I'm going to just change tack here a little bit and try and pick up two questions in one. So Peter Moran has just asked, was there an analysis of the business, the effectiveness of business use of the technology? But there was also earlier, there was a question about how can we turn Australia's strong performance, and clearly we've got good performance in all the dimensions of transport that were measured. How can we turn that good performance into onshore development of products that can ultimately be perhaps exploited even in other countries? And I'm thinking here in particular that the US has just announced humongous funding for infrastructure repair or rebuilding, and I'm wondering, is there a way by which Australian industry can utilise learnings developed in Australia and exploit them more broadly? So that's a kind of a complicated question. It goes to industry research engagement, and it goes to the commercialisation of the technologies at which we're particularly good. Hussein?
Yeah. So I think in the first part of the question is, if we looked at the various businesses and their effective use of technology, we haven't. But I suspect this is something that we're going to look at in this new project, where we're looking at the future workforce and skills. But again, I think it goes, I totally agree with what you mentioned there, Ian, and I think it goes down to that slide I showed about strengthening the engagement between the research organizations and the industry. Something exactly like this CRC is doing. Australia clearly punches above its weight when it comes to research outputs and outcomes. The bottleneck or the barrier there is the commercialization of research outputs. I've heard it has been suggested in the past that perhaps there could be funds that are set separately. I think they do it in the medical industry. Funds that can be set separately to encourage universities to collaborate with industry with a view to commercialize. So that could be one way we can actually capitalize on the intellectual output and make sure that you get a product or a technology outcome for the industry partners, which they can add value to, export, etc.
Thanks, Hussein. You mentioned in that answer, you made the connection at some level to the level of skill that is available to companies organizations in the public and private sector. I'm wondering what role that plays, or how important it is to invest in skill levels in order for Australia to be able to better exploit the smart technologies that it develops. And that's possibly a question for Hussein, but Hadi, I also wondered, in your survey of stakeholders, did anyone reference or speak about a level of interest in skill development? So perhaps Hussein first.
Yeah. So thank you. Yes, that's quite relevant as well. And in our report, we reference a study, a survey actually, ABS Business Characteristics Survey done in 2020, which actually found that some of the barriers, when they surveyed the industry said some of the barriers for the lack of digitalization was internet speeds. I'm just quoting here, internet speeds, uncertainty of benefits, insufficient knowledge, and lack of skills. These were, according to the industry, identified in this survey. So it is an issue. The industry is saying it is an issue. We're currently witnessing one of the largest or the most significant skills shortages in recent times, manifesting itself in everything, not only digitization. So that is, I think, a key thing that we're going to be targeting in this new study, is to look at what are the skills required now and into the future, what training needs to be provided as well.
Hadi, did your stakeholders respond to this issue?
Yes, absolutely. There were a number of cases. They have discussed the matter for reskilling, upskilling, but also because these are two completely, different, and also the form, the right and appropriate form of upskilling and reskilling, because also from a higher education and perspective, things have changed, and therefore the needs are different. The way we deliver education is also different, and this should also be more aligned with what the industry requires, but also with the existing skill shortages and gap, which, as Hussein mentioned, we're specifically looking at this in our next project with the department.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we're getting close to the end of time. So I'm going to sort of throw in a kind of Dorothy Dixer towards the end now. But before I do that, I just invite all the attendees, if you've got any last questions, now would be a good time to submit them. But my one of the things that struck me from your report was the level of positive sentiment across the community towards digitalisation. It was spectacular, in a word, and to me that bodes well for the future. It feels like the community is behind you or behind us in terms of progressing vigorously down a digitisation path. Am I reading it correctly? Is that what you're hearing?
I think so, and this is also aligned with what Andrew mentioned just a few minutes ago, that the industry is already trialing new technologies, uptaking the new technology. So there is also, this shows investment and interest by the public sector, how to capitalize and leverage on this investment and on this interest, and create synergy. That's a different thing. But I do agree, and that's a very positive news, and it's fantastic that there is such level of interest and positive sentiment towards adoption and seeing digitalization as an opportunity, not as a disruption or challenge in particular. Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we are coming to a close. I'm looking at the questions that have been raised. Peter Creedon, we'll need to take up the question of engagement with the Digital Container Shipping Association outside for its opportunities. So it just remains for me to thank Professor Deer and Dr. Ghaderi for their not only their beautiful presentation, but their huge work by them and their team at Swinburne on this report. It's I think all of you in the audience have access to the report, and I commend it to you. It's quite big, it's quite deep, but I say it's very well worth your time to dig into it, into the areas that are of most interest. There's a mass of useful information. The report, this webinar, will both be made available through the iMOVE website. And I'll just think, are there any other things that I have to mention? Other than to say thanks to our presenters, and thanks to you, the audience, for your time and attention. I hope it's been useful. I've certainly found it particularly interesting and valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We would welcome all feedback. You can find us on the Swinburne website. Any feedback on the report, any additional comments would be most welcome.
That's super.
Thank you very much.